I mentioned in my last video that I was going to be reviewing this soon, and now is the time. This is Final Events, and the Final Events and the Secret Government Group on Demonic UFOs and the Afterlife by Nick Redfern. Excuse me. And this was published in 2010. And that, yes, 2010, and that date is going to be important. I'm going to come back to that here in a little bit. But I'm going to give you kind of a Cliff Notes version, Cliff Notes review first, and then I'm going to get into, I don't know if spoiler's the right way, but I'm going to get a lot deeper into this and be covering some of the content a little bit more in depth later in the review. So I say that because there might be some of you that want to read this without hearing any of my bias about it and then come back, because I do highly recommend this book. But I do have some strong opinions about some of the things in it. So anyway, if you are, so the Cliff Notes version first. So this is all about the angle of the UFO phenomenon from the perspective of this is possibly a spiritual phenomenon, more so than extraterrestrial or even extra dimensional. And Nick Redfern has written a few other books about UFOs and alien abduction phenomenon and things like that. He's written a lot of like stuff about the Men in Black and a lot of paranormal kind of topics. And overall, I like a lot of his work. I think I've reviewed at least a couple of his books on my channel. So I like his writing. I think he's a thorough investigator. He digs up a lot of stuff. This book is no exception. And so overall, just that's what you're getting into with this book, is his angle of pursuing the UFO topic, starting with the lead of an Anglican priest that tells him that he was brought in to kind of brief this group of UFO people within the government that call themselves the Collins elite. And this Anglican priest was asked to give his advice on certain spiritual matters to this group. And then that's kind of the jumping off point of his investigation. And then he goes around the country and talks to a variety of different experts and personalities in the UFO profession and people in the government and all that, as he's running down all these leads. So that is the book in a nutshell. And obviously, I mean, this is one of those topics where there's no way to put a nice tidy bow on the end of it when you do it, because obviously this is still, if he did figure it all out, it would obviously be major, world-changing news. So at least you would hope. So it is kind of open-ended at the end. He leaves it with, here's kind of what I figured out, and here are some possibilities of what might be happening with this information, and leaves it at that. And that's true. Obviously, there's a lot of different literature that in this subject area that's a lot like that. But anyway, so overall, I appreciate his efforts, and I think it's a good book. And it was good enough that I actually bought it twice, because I bought this back a couple of years ago and read it. And then I lost it, and I had to buy a new one so I could review it and have it physically here, and also go back through and dog-ear some of the key portions of it. So it was good enough that I bought it twice. So make whatever you will of that decision. But anyway, so now I'm going to get into the more, spoilers is probably not the right way to put it for nonfiction, but I would definitely recommend, if you're curious about this, and especially if some of you are interested in the member section, I may do a deeper dive just with this book and some of the adjacent material, because this pairs nicely with Dr. Michael Heiser's, I think I'm saying his name right, his work on the unseen realm. And some of you have talked about that book and that you're familiar with that. And that, dear viewers, is Owen the Cat, who, just in case you need an Owen the Cat fix, come on, buddy. Here you go. There's Owen the Cat. All right, buddy. You've had your moment there. And I don't know if the microphone is picking up Owen purring, but Owen is a cat from the streets. He followed me home, and he is just my little buddy. And he followed me home, I think, just before Christmas. And we had to have him do 2 different rounds of deworming with him to get him cleaned up because he was in bad shape. But he is the most grateful cat. He just purrs all the time, and he is just busy getting fat. When he's not chasing the older cats around, he is just busy getting fat. Right, Owen? So, anyway, that is Owen. There's your Owen update. So, anyway, so now for the deeper part of the review. Now, first off, one of the things that shocked me kind of right out of the gate was his introduction of some of the occult elements of this, of Jack Parsons, which, if you're following this channel, you're probably already aware of this, but Jack Parsons, the kind of the grandfather of a lot of rocketry, along with, I believe, Robert Goddard. I think I'm remembering my rocketry people right. But Jack Parsons was a friend of L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard actually ran off with one of his girlfriends, one of Jack Parsons' girlfriends. A lot of bizarre drama between the two of them. And he does talk about some of that in the first chapter of this, first couple of chapters. And Jack Parsons got a lot of his inspiration in the occult inspiration from Aleister Crowley. So lots of strange stuff there right out of the gate. And Aleister Crowley said that these entities that he was summoning, when he described them, sound familiar to what we would now call the Greys or whatever. And supposedly, this is where things get really weird. Of what we know about Jack Parsons' history, we know that he died in an explosion, and allegedly trying to summon a moonchild or create a moonchild, which is kind of Gollum adjacent, and I'll get back to that here in a little bit. But he actually died in an explosion in his laboratory doing this. And Jack Parsons is what JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or Jack Parsons Laboratory, however you want to look at that, is named after. So Jack Parsons was a major guy in the founding of the modern space program. So it's kind of very curious that this guy was also very, very much steeped in the occult. And it is now 10 o'clock. And just so you guys know that I don't just sit in my house dressed like this with a sport coat on, I actually just got back from watching my daughter's ballet performance. So that's why I'm a little bit more spiffed up than usual. So I didn't get dressed up just to sit here and film this video. But I do value you as an audience, and I would do that. I just didn't do that at 10 o'clock at night. Just got back, and I wanted to get this review done. So here we are. Anyway, and I should say one more little bit of housekeeping for somebody that was asking what kind of camera I used, and someone else pointed out that my latest videos look very cinematic. And I hope I answered everybody that was saying stuff like that. I can't always remember which comments I've addressed or not. But it's not that I got a new camera, it's just that I learned how to use the camera that I have. So I have an Osmo Pocket camera, and I just finally, after a couple of years, I finally learned how to use all the manual settings to get a little bit better looking picture. So I'm glad it was noticeable. I'm glad the output onto the internet was decent enough that some of you appreciated the quality. So anyway, but back to Jack Parsons and the occult and final events. Is one of the things that he points out here early on, and I'm just going to jump right in mid-sentence here, is he's talking about Jack Parson and some of the strange things swirling around him. And he says he was talking about he's listening to very carefully to the whistleblower words of this secret-filled old soul, and talking about this guy telling him about what all's going on. And all of which were focused upon secret investigations of Jack Parsons by U.S. intelligence, the issue of Parsons' loyalty to the United States, his links to the government of Israel, and his relationship to Aleister Crowley. So I found that very curious. And based on that, and again, I'll get back to that later on in the video, but that really surprised me because that's the first I had heard of a connection between Jack Parsons and the nation state of political Israel. So that was a curious connection. But he goes on to say that basically this Collins elite, he's able to get an audience with one of these guys directly that's part of this group. And the Collins elite, the way he describes it, is kind of a deep state adjacent group. It's not a government group. It's kind of an independent scientific group, kind of a council. So they're not under the regular oversight of the federal government. It's a really kind of bizarre thing. And the interesting thing that he's saying, basically what he's establishing here and his overall kind of working theory as he's going through this, and I say theory, what he's saying, claiming that the Collins elite guys have told him, is that there's this secret group called the Collins elite that is at odds with what we would now refer to as the deep state, this collection of intelligence agencies and all that are actively participating in this whole demonic thing that, and one of the things he's trying to unravel is, did all of this start with Jack Parsons? And did he open up some, doorway to this other realm, or did nuclear weapons open up this doorway to this other realm that allowed this spiritual connection to occur? And he also talks about Kenneth Arnold, the one who coined the term flying saucer and all that, and a connection between Kenneth Arnold and Jack Parsons or Aleister Crowley and some things like that. There's a lot of connections that he finds here that I'd never heard of before, and that alone is worth getting the book. But that's the picture he paints as he starts out in the first half of the book. And I'd say he starts off very strong. I think there's a lot of really good information in this book. Starting off, it's all about this, like basically the deep state that is actively pursuing technology from this basically like a demonic entity, a group of entities, or however you want to look at it, that is actively working with this demonic group. And then you got this other group called the Collins Elite that has a problem with this and is trying to find a way to subvert it or stop it or whatever. And one of the things that he keeps coming up with as he moves through, he has a whole section about abductions and all kinds of alien-related kind of topics, and that basically these are, according to this group, the Collins Elite, this is actually a demonic phenomenon that is trying to masquerade as aliens. And that is very much in keeping with a lot of the information by Dr. Carla Turner, the late Dr. Carla Turner. Not that she really gets that specific with it, but a lot of her information was that these entities are very deceptive and they lie and they deliberately obscure the truth to get their way, and that they're never giving people a straight story. And one of the things he finds is common thread that this Collins Elite group has figured out is that all these abductees and all these contactees are all telling the same kind of scenario of this like end times apocalyptic scenario. And how the entities, these demonic entities or whatever they are, seem to be steering people in this direction of believing in this very apocalyptic sort of scenario. And this is where my personal views of some of these things depart from Nick Redfern's. Because the thing that I found a little troubling is he sets up the first half to even 2/3 of the book are all about how deceptive these entities are, and they're really wanting us to believe that we're about to be destroyed and all this, so that we will make a pact with them of some kind or whatever. Okay? But then towards the end, he kind of switches gears and says, and kind of agrees with some of these end time things. Oh yeah, we're obviously in the end times and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, wait, no, but you just spent the first part of the book telling me that they're deceiving us into believing this. So if you know, it's kind of like right now, that's kind of my same beef with a lot of the people, a lot of my peers that research a lot of this stuff. They know about Epstein, they know about all the blackmail stuff, but then they don't appreciate that the blackmail is being used to accomplish an end. So what is that end? And, you can't ignore when you see leaders do things against their own self-interest and be like, well, that can't possibly be related to the blackmail. No, that very much is probably related to blackmail. So anyway, it's a similar kind of thing. It's like you can't tell me all this information and then introduce more information that is very obviously a byproduct of this and say, yeah, but this is not, I'm going to separate these two things out. So that was a little frustrating. Now, then there's also, he spends a whole chapter talking about alien abductions. And this is why I dug out some of my abduction-related material. And there is an abductee that he cites in here. And I'll just read this abductee named Allison that had several abduction experiences. And I've covered one of her books in the past, and I'll see if I can link it in the end screen, if I can find it, because I can't remember the name of it. But this lady's name is Allison, and let's see. I think that's all he says here is Allison. So, but I've got her book. I remember this story from her. It's kind of a self-published book about her abduction experiences. But she was abducted several times, and she lived in Arizona, in the Sedona area. And then she relays this experience, which he's quoting here. During what Allison believes was the fifth abduction, however, something even weirder took place. The mysterious humming sound abruptly came to a halt. So she heard this like humming sound that, really disoriented her, and she started seeing aliens moving around in her house. Anyway, and so the humming happens. She's seeing the aliens moving around her house. And then she says the mysterious humming sound abruptly came to a halt only a few seconds after her allegedly cosmic visitors entered the room. At that point, Allison recalled, not in a later dream on this occasion, but in real time, she began to slowly regain her senses, and the feeling of disorientation eased and then completely vanished. And so did the aliens. In their place was not a group of frail-looking, black-eyed extraterrestrials, but a number of rather large and burly men in what looked like black combat fatigues. According to Allison, one of the men screamed into a microphone, "What happened?" The men backed slowly away as Allison began to regain her senses. One of them held up his hand as if to say, "Stay where you are," and uttered the word "sorry" in her direction in a rather awkward fashion. Allison made her way to the window in plenty of time to see the men jump into an unmarked black helicopter. At a height of several hundred feet, a powerful lamp was turned on that lit up the night sky around her secluded property. So much for a genuine spaceship. Now, and then he follows up saying, today, Allison firmly believes that a combination of subliminal hypnosis, mind-altering techniques, and perhaps even non-lethal weaponry designed to temporarily disable her nervous system and bodily movement made her think she was an alien abductee. In reality, however, she was merely a guinea pig for the testing of sophisticated weaponry designed to affect and manipulate both mind and body to an incredible degree. Now, and I'm like, yeah, okay. Again, now we're back in the domain of some of the material touched on in these two books, the Millabs and Dulce Base, especially Millabs, which is all about the phenomenon of military abductions, which is where you get the term Millab, but the military cooperating allegedly with alien groups or whatever. So he relays that and some other similar tales. And then he has a few chapters later, he says this is all smoke and mirrors by the aliens. And this is where he lost me. And like I said, I think there's a lot of good information in this book. But this part, I'm sorry, I can't go there. This just does not fit with the evidence. And that is saying that basically this whole thing of the covert operation end of it is all a smokescreen put on these people's minds by the aliens. And I find that very hard to believe because we already have a lot of evidence of covert operations, and we have plenty of evidence of people reporting advanced technology that, a few years later wound up being what used to be classified technology and now is no longer, that people were reporting in old abductions. Like there was a good example of that was some of the early abductions. Women were reporting, and this is in Martin Cannon's The Controllers, these like needles going into their bellies where they're pregnant and taking samples of amniotic fluid and stuff. And the methods they were describing are now outdated. But at the time, they were fairly modern. But things like that at the time might have been advanced for the 60s, but have since become obsolete. And then, in the 70s or 80s, they might have been like, oh, hey, that's what happened. That's the same thing they did on me. And now, of course, that's old technology. So anyway, then he also mentions Greg Bishop, and that's why I dug out Project Beta. And I'm pretty sure I have reviewed Project Beta. If I could find that review, I will link it on the end screen. But Project Beta is all about Paul Benowitz and all of what happened to him in New Mexico. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with this book. There's some good information in it, but this is one I throw out. A lot of it is very questionable because he relied very heavily on two self-professed disinfo agents, Richard Doty and Bill Moore, both of whom came forward later declaring themselves to have been disinformation agents. And I think part of the reason they came out later and said that was to further discredit a lot of the other people they had worked with. So anyway, but one of the things that he talks about that Nick Redfern also mentions is the case of, I believe it's Myrna Hansen, this abductee back in the early 80s who was abducted in northern New Mexico. And she recalled very specific security measures of where she was taken by the aliens to a base inside a mountain. And when she described this to Paul Benowitz and others, what she described was, in very good detail, she described the way they had a magnetic security card that they used, and this of course, is in the early days of this sort of thing, to get through these security doors, and she described exactly the way you got into the Monsanto nuclear complex. Now, that doesn't mean that's where she went, but that means she knew Air Force high security stuff that she should not have known. So very specific things about that security. It'd be like a good analogy for that would be like if someone in 1965 was able to describe a 1995 ATM and in great detail, and a lot of it wouldn't really register until somebody saw that ATM and realized, wow, she's describing exactly that. And same kind of thing. And the Air Force personnel knew, wow, this lady knows exactly what she saw. And she saw inside an extremely high security secret facility. Now, the way Greg Bishop, musing aloud with Richard Doty, the way he solves this problem so that he doesn't have to involve the covert operation angle, and the same thing Nick Redfern jumps onto here, is that some weird phenomenon happened where this woman was somehow opened up some kind of portal where she remote viewed inside a super secret high security facility. It's like, okay, I'm sorry, but that's where it's like Occam's razor. Which is simpler, that this interdimensional portal opened up and allowed her to see into a nuclear facility, or it happened as she described, where she was taken possibly using high technology to cloud some of her other views of things, like the other woman here describing seeing these beings or whatever in this humming sound. but actually being taken to a very secure underground facility. So that was one of the things that bothered me, was he tried to discount that whole angle of covert operations. And that's kind of the same angle that's done in this book too by Greg Bishop, about saying the whole thing of Dulce base, all that's a myth. And I'll say from firsthand experience, in 97, and if you go into some of my older videos, I talk at length about a lot of this. I've been looking into the whole Dulce thing since 1991. 97, fall of 97 was the first year I actually made a trip out there with my late father. And we were actually run off from the area around the Redding Ranch by a white pickup truck with red and blue lights. And it was right around the time we saw what I can only describe as guard towers around the perimeter of a ranch there. And I remember thinking, that's weird. And right about the time I saw that and pointed that out to my dad, behind us we saw a pickup truck with flashing red and blue lights, and two guys, I couldn't tell how they were dressed or anything, two guys with sunglasses on in a truck behind us. And at first we thought, well, maybe it's tribal police or something. Maybe we were accidentally on tribal land, and we were trying to find a place to pull over because we were like, did we, break the speed limit? We're on a little one-lane dirt road, and there was no real convenient place to pull over. So we just slowed down, and we were driving around a couple of turns, and then these guys were gone. We're like, okay, that's strange. And now, ever since talking to some of the locals and all there, and now I think the Redding Ranch was ground zero for a lot of those operations. Now, was the Redding Ranch, was it a massive, mile-deep underground city of vast proportions or whatever? Probably not. And that's the problem I have with the approach of guys like Greg Bishop or Nick Redfern to throw some of this stuff out. It's like, just because one piece of evidence, it doesn't line up. And that's where I think guys like John Lear were the ones that really pushed out that idea of Dulce, New Mexico, having this massive biolab that was basically an underground city. And as a result, thus poisoning the well and making that sound so preposterous, people didn't take it seriously. But that's the problem with this kind of approach is, well, because this one bit of evidence I looked into didn't turn out to be true, then everything adjacent to it must also be not true. And that's not how you investigate. There's plenty of topics that you say, okay, that if that piece of evidence is not true, then we're going to take that out. And if this other piece of evidence is true, then that is true. All that means is that information is true. And we can use that to pull at other threads and figure other things out. But you don't discount an entire body of evidence because one thing turned out not to be true, or one part turned out to be disinformation. So anyway, enough about that. But personally, this is where I would disagree with him, because in a way he lays the groundwork pretty good for there being a very solid footing for both a covert operative or covert operations angle as well as a possible spiritual angle. I think that is probably a more logical explanation of some of that. To what degree, I don't know, but I think both of those things can be true at the same time. There could be both of those things happening. And he does make the point, and I think this is a valid point, that about people who have called on the name of Christ when they are being visited by these beings or whatever, and then they suddenly disappear, or the abduction ends when they do that. And he points out that it is curious, why would these guys, also talking about the aliens, kind of trying to discredit Christ or Jesus, and pointing out how, yeah, that is kind of weird. Why would these guys travel billions of miles from light years away to discredit a very specific earthly religion? Like, that doesn't make any sense either. So anyway, back to this. So there's a lot of good information in here. These are all books that I was thinking about as I was working through this. But towards the end, where it really frustrated me a lot was he talks about at the end, there's he's listing out the different kind of end times approach of various sects of Christianity, and mentions like preterism, millennialism, dispensationalism, and all that. And then he says, and this I thought again was very strange. He says, but they all agree on there being a peace treaty between Israel and the Antichrist. I'm like, no, they don't all agree on that. So it's very frustrating that towards the end of the book, he starts citing a lot of stuff that you're like, well, that sounds like something the aliens would say based on what you just told me in the first 2/3 of the book. So this is where we get back to the year this was published. So this is 2010. Well, in the last 16 years, obviously a lot has happened in the Middle East. And more people are realizing the sham that is a lot of the political Zionism and a lot of the end times theology that has been used to prop up a lot of contemporary politics. And then you get into a lot of the just very bizarre, like Greater Israel Project and the Third Temple and all that kind of stuff. And you can't help but see the parallels with a lot of this. So if Nick Redfern is out there, I would love to see a follow-up to this book, or just talk to him about it too, but see a follow-up that breaks down the connections with modern Zionism, because he does mention the Talmud in this, and he mentions it though in the context of a golem, which the golem thing I thought was from the Kabbalah and specifically from the Zohar, but I haven't read literally every single page of the Talmud, so there could be a reference to that. But there is a whole section in this about golem and the idea of people trying to create a golem. And I think there is definitely a thread there worth pulling on of connecting the whole idea of the gray aliens being a modern day golem. So, but anyway, so getting back to, just to wrap it all up, the whole Jack Parsons thing, spying for Israel, or, having loyalties to the then infant state of political Israel, you can't help but go, okay, that's major. Having this big occult figure that's trying to create a moonchild, and then he also is potentially spying for this other nation state, what exactly is going on? And then by the end of the book, you're like, okay, as someone who has studied Zionism extensively for the last better part of 20 some years now, it's like, okay, why are we not talking about that? So that would be, to me, that's the weak link in all of this, is the very last part of it, where he even brings up that Ronald Reagan had all this apocalyptic literature in the White House that was all like Tim LaHaye, like the Left Behind stuff and all that he was reading in the White House. And after telling us about this for the first 2/3 of the book, you're like, that's a big problem, because you're telling me that a lot of the Left Behind kind of theology is, he doesn't make this connection, but if you are aware of it and you read what he's saying here about these entities, you can't help but see that these things are connected, that this would be the teaching brought about by these aliens. So anyway, other than that, the last part of the book being somewhat frustrating on that, there's a lot of good information. And I think this is definitely worth one of those. And like I said in the Cliff Notes thing up front, there's definitely a lot of information in this that is worth getting the book, regardless of whether or not you agree with his conclusions. Just some of the names, dates, places. It's well sourced. A lot of good information on this. Just the chapter about the golem, I think that alone is a starting point for a lot of other investigative work. So anyway, I do like it, but it did frustrate me a little bit, and I would love to see what he would think of this now in light of what's happened in the last 16 years. Because again, now we have a lot of people who, in my friend and family group, that didn't even know what Zionism was. I would bring that up. I remember I had friends and family just, as recently as 10 years ago that didn't think, when I explained to them what Zionism was, thought I was making that up. They didn't realize that was a legitimate political philosophy. And now it's kind of come out of the closet and it's all over the place. But anyway, so that is Final Events by Nick Redfern. I'll see what some of this other stuff I can link on the end screen. But overall, I think this is a good book, and I definitely want to come back to this because I'm almost done with Michael Heiser's book, Unseen Realm. And this pairs nicely with that. There's a lot of, he brings up the Nephilim in this and all those things. So once I finish Unseen Realm, I may be coming back to this again. And for some of you in the member section, if you'd like to do a deeper dive on this, because there's definitely some of the occult angles that I'd like to go into a little bit more, just talking about that. So anyway, that is Final Events by Nick Redfern from 2010. And hope y'all are all having a good Saturday night. And I'll have some more reviews up soon enough.